Margaret set the newspaper down with shaking fingers, the ink smudging slightly against her skin as if it had been printed moments ago. The coffee cup left a ring of moisture on the mahogany desk, impossibly real and warm in a house that should have been a tomb of dust and neglect. "Harold," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the persistent ticking of that grandfather clock. "This isn't possible." Her husband stood frozen in the doorway of the study, one weathered hand pressed against his chest, where his heart had betrayed him 3 months ago. The doctor had warned about stress, about taking things easy in their golden years. Moving to Connecticut from their cramped Boston apartment was supposed to be their peaceful chapter, a chance to stretch Harold's pension and Margaret's modest teacher's retirement in a place where $10,000 could buy them a decent cottage with a garden. Instead, they'd found this listing buried in the back pages of a real estate circular. Estate sale, historic property, as is, $10 OBO. Margaret had laughed when she'd seen it, assuming it was a typo, but the agent, a thin woman with nervous eyes who'd introduced herself only as Miss Chen, had insisted the price was correct. "The family just wants it gone," she'd explained during their hurried meeting at the local diner. "No inspections, no warranties, cash only. You take possession immediately." Now Margaret understood why the woman had seemed so eager to leave. Harold stepped deeper into the study, his carpenter's eye taking in details that Margaret's shock had missed. The leather chair was worn in a specific pattern, molded to one person's body over years of use. A flight jacket hung on a wooden valet, the leather supple and uncreased. On the wall, photographs showed a young man in pilot's gear standing beside various aircraft, B-17 seconds, P-51 Mustangs, planes Margaret recognized from Harold's war documentaries. "The heating system," Harold said suddenly, his practical mind grasping for rational explanations. "Maybe there's a caretaker, someone maintaining the property." But even as he spoke, they both knew how hollow that sounded. A caretaker who set out fresh newspapers from 1943? Who brewed coffee in a kitchen where the calendar on the wall showed October in a year when Roosevelt was still president? Margaret moved to the window, pulling back heavy blackout curtains that should have rotted decades ago. The fabric felt new under her fingers, the brass rings sliding smoothly along the rod. Outside, the Connecticut countryside stretched away in the morning fog, unchanged from any autumn day. But here, inside these walls, time had taken on different rules. She thought of her classroom back in Boston, where she'd taught fifth graders for 4 decades. How many times had she stood before those eager faces, explaining the difference between fact and fiction, between what we can prove and what we merely imagine? She'd built her life on logic, on the solid foundation of observable truth. History moved in one direction. The past stayed buried. The dead remained dead. "Look at this," Harold called from behind the desk. He was holding a leather-bound logbook, its pages filled with precise handwriting in blue fountain pen ink. Flight records, by the look of it, with dates, times, aircraft serial numbers. Margaret leaned over his shoulder, her reading glasses sliding down her nose as she scanned the entries. "Mission briefing 0600 hours," she read aloud. "Target, submarine pens, Normandy coast. Aircraft B-17F, serial number 42 to 29,782. Crew complement 9 souls." The entry was dated October 10, 1943, 5 days ago, according to the newspaper on the desk. Harold flipped through more pages, his breathing growing shallow. "Margaret, look at these dates. October 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th. All recent, all in the same handwriting." She wanted to argue, to find some logical explanation. Forgery, perhaps. An elaborate hoax. But the evidence surrounded them like morning fog. The warm coffee, the fresh flowers, the ticking clock that marked time in a world that should have ended 80 years ago. From somewhere deeper in the house came a sound that made them both freeze. Footsteps. Slow, measured, crossing what sounded like the floor above their heads. Harold's hand found hers, his wedding ring clicking against her own. 52 years of marriage had taught them to communicate in glances, and the look that passed between them now held a lifetime of shared fear and determination. They had two choices: run from this impossible place and spend the rest of their lives wondering, or climb those stairs and confront whatever waited in the rooms above. Margaret thought of the confident young woman she'd been at 25, facing her first classroom full of skeptical children. She'd learned courage then, teaching order in the chaos of young minds. The footsteps paused directly overhead, as if whoever walked there had heard their whispered conversation and was listening. Margaret squeezed Harold's hand. "Together," she said. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, marking an hour that belonged to a war-torn world where their parents had been young and the future had stretched ahead like an unmapped territory full of terrible possibility. The 9th chime of the grandfather clock faded into silence, leaving only the sound of their synchronized breathing and the weight of an impossible decision. Margaret felt Harold's pulse through his palm, rapid but steady, the heart that had carried him through 73 years of ordinary mornings, predictable afternoons, and peaceful evenings in their small Boston apartment. That apartment seemed like a dream now, with its familiar creaking floorboards that announced Harold's 6 a.m. shuffle to the kitchen, where he'd start the coffee and arrange her pills beside her favorite mug, the one their daughter Jenny had given her last Christmas, painted with tiny apples and the words, "World's Best Teacher." Every morning for 52 years, the same ritual: Harold's gentle kiss on her forehead, the rustle of newspaper pages, the comfortable silence of two people who'd learned to love each other's rhythms. Their old life had been small but complete. Margaret's students sent her letters still, decades after graduation, telling her about their children, their careers, their dreams. She'd kept everyone in a shoebox under their bed, proof that her 4 decades in the classroom had mattered. Harold's workshop in their building's basement was cluttered with half-finished birdhouses and repair projects for neighbors who trusted his steady hands and patient eye. They weren't wealthy. Teachers, pensions, and Social Security barely stretched to cover rising rents. But they'd been content. Until Harold's heart attack 3 months ago. She'd found him collapsed beside their kitchen table, his coffee mug shattered on the linoleum, his face gray as October sky. The ambulance ride, the waiting room vigil, the doctor's careful words about damaged arteries and lifestyle changes. It had all conspired to show them how fragile their ordinary world really was. "You need to reduce stress," Dr. Martinez had said, his kind eyes serious behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Consider relocating somewhere quieter, somewhere you can stretch your retirement dollars and have space to breathe." The overhead footsteps resumed, a methodical pace that spoke of purpose, of routine. Someone moving through their daily rituals just as she and Harold had done for half a century. The sound should have terrified her, but instead Margaret felt an unexpected pang of recognition. This was what living looked like, the small, repeated actions that marked time's passage. Harold's grip tightened. She could see him calculating distances to the front door, escape routes, explanations they might give to authorities. His carpenter's mind worked like that, always problem-solving, always building solutions from available materials. But what tools could fix a house that existed outside time's natural order? "We could leave," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Drive back to Boston, pretend this never happened." But they both knew that was impossible. They'd sold their apartment, packed their modest belongings into their aging Honda Civic, burned the bridges that had anchored them to their predictable life. Their daughter Jenny lived in Seattle now, busy with her own family, sending dutiful monthly phone calls but no invitations. Their friends from the old neighborhood had scattered to assisted living facilities or warmer climates. Boston held nothing for them anymore except higher rents and the ghost of Harold's collapsed body on cold linoleum. The footsteps crossed directly overhead again, and this time Margaret heard something else, a faint humming, barely perceptible through the old house's solid construction. A tune she almost recognized, something from the war years her parents had lived through. Her mother had hummed while cooking, especially when Margaret's father was overseas with Patton's Third Army. It was the sound of someone keeping faith, maintaining normalcy in the face of uncertainty. 52 years, Margaret said quietly, surprising herself with the words. "We've been together 52 years, and this is the strangest place we've ever been." Harold's laugh caught in his throat, more nervous than amused. "Remember our honeymoon? That cabin in the Adirondacks with no running water? And the bear that got into our food?" She smiled despite their circumstances. "You chased it away with a frying pan. I was 21 and stupid. You were brave." Above them, a door opened and closed with a soft click. The footsteps moved in a different direction now, toward what might be a staircase. Margaret thought about the life they'd built together. Not glamorous, perhaps, but solid. 2 teachers' salaries had bought them a small apartment, modest vacations, and the luxury of books. Harold had learned carpentry in night school, turning his hobby into supplemental income that paid for Jenny's college tuition. They'd been practical people living a practical life, measuring success in paid bills and shared dinners and the comfortable silence of Sunday mornings. Now they stood in a house where impossibility leaked from every corner like morning fog, where the rules they'd lived by no longer applied. Margaret felt something stirring in her chest, not fear exactly, but a recognition she hadn't experienced since her first day teaching. The anticipation of stepping into unknown territory, where courage mattered more than preparation. The footsteps reached what sounded like the top of the stairs and paused, as if their owner was listening, deciding, gathering resolve for whatever came next. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Margaret felt Harold's hand trembling in hers, or perhaps it was her own hand shaking. The footsteps above had stopped so completely that she wondered if she'd imagined them, if the stress of the impossible warning had finally cracked something fundamental in her mind. Then she heard it, the unmistakable creak of someone beginning to descend wooden stairs. "Margaret." Harold's voice was barely a whisper. "We need to—" But his words were cut off by a new sound that made Margaret's blood turn to ice water in her veins. Humming. The same melody she'd almost recognized before, now clearer, closer, accompanied by the measured footsteps of someone coming down to meet them. It was "I'll Be Seeing You," the song her mother had hummed while waiting for news from the European theater, the melody that had soundtracked her childhood during those long war years, when every telegram might bring news of death, every knock at the door might herald devastation. Margaret's rational mind, the one that had organized lesson plans and graded papers and explained fractions to generations of children, began cataloging impossible details. The humming voice was rich, male, comfortable in its skin. The footsteps belonged to someone who knew these stairs intimately, who could navigate them in darkness if necessary. This wasn't a stranger who had broken into an abandoned house. This was someone coming home. Harold pulled her toward the study's door, his carpenter's instincts finally overriding shock. "The back of the house," he whispered urgently. "There has to be another way out." But Margaret found herself rooted in place, not by fear, but by something else entirely. In her 4 decades of teaching, she'd learned to recognize moments when everything changed, when a struggling student suddenly grasped a concept, when a classroom of chaos crystallized into understanding, when the impossible became inevitable. She felt that same electric anticipation now, as if she stood on the threshold of a lesson she'd spent her entire life preparing to learn. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. She could hear them clearly now, moving through what must be the front hallway, past rooms they hadn't yet explored. The humming had shifted to "We'll Meet Again," another song that belonged to a world where rationing was reality and victory gardens grew in suburban backyards. 52 years, she said again, this time louder, her teacher's voice carrying the authority that had once commanded attention from restless 10-year-olds. "We've been playing it safe for 52 years, Harold. When was the last time we did something that mattered? Really mattered?" Harold stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, his free hand pressed against his chest where his weak heart hammered against his ribs. She could see him calculating odds, weighing risks, applying the careful logic that had gotten them through 5 decades of bills and responsibilities and the quiet desperation of ordinary life. The footsteps paused near what she guessed was the kitchen. She heard the clink of porcelain, a cup being set in a saucer perhaps, or lifted from one. Whoever was in the house was having their morning coffee, following a routine that had somehow persisted, across 80 years of abandoned time. "Margaret, please." Harold's voice cracked like an adolescent boy's. "My heart can't take much more of this." But she was already thinking beyond his fear, beyond her own terror, to the questions that would haunt them forever if they ran. How did newspapers stay fresh for 8 decades? Why did the clock still tick with such mechanical precision? What force kept coffee warm in a house that should have been a mausoleum of dust and decay? Most importantly, what did it mean to be 71 years old and still capable of surprise? The footsteps resumed, moving with obvious purpose toward the study where they stood frozen in their moment of impossible choice. Margaret heard the soft whisper of wool against wood, someone in a uniform perhaps, the fabric brushing against door frames as he moved through his morning routine. She thought of Jenny, safe in Seattle with her software engineer husband and their 2 children who called her Grandma Margaret during stilted holiday phone calls. Jenny would inherit whatever was left of their modest savings, would arrange for a simple memorial service, would file the paperwork that reduced a lifetime of small joys to legal documents. Their death would be unremarkable, a brief obituary in the Boston Globe noting Margaret's years of service to the school district and Harold's volunteer work at the community center. Or they could stay. They could meet whatever approached through these preserved rooms and discover what lay beyond the edge of everything they thought they understood, about time, memory, and the persistence of the human heart in the face of impossible loss. The footsteps stopped directly outside the study door. Margaret squeezed Harold's hand and stepped forward, choosing wonder over safety, mystery over the known world that had grown too small to hold them. The doorknob began to turn. The brass doorknob clicked once, twice, as if the person on the other side was testing the mechanism. In that suspended moment, Margaret felt her resolve crumble like chalk in her trembling fingers. What had she been thinking? She was a 71-year-old retired teacher whose greatest adventure in the past decade had been switching grocery stores. Harold was recovering from a heart attack, his medication bottles rattling in his jacket pocket like dice in a cup. They had no business confronting whatever impossible thing waited beyond that door. "Wait," she whispered, pulling Harold backward toward the window. "Wait, But her words dissolved as the doorknob stopped turning. The presence on the other side seemed to pause, listening, and Margaret realized with crystalline horror that whatever was out there had heard her voice. Harold's breathing came in short, sharp bursts. She could see the gray pallor creeping up his neck, the same ashen color that had terrified her in their kitchen 3 months ago when she'd found him, collapsed beside the shattered coffee mug. Dr. Martinez's words echoed in her memory, "No undue stress. His heart can't handle sudden shocks." What could be more shocking than a house that existed outside time's natural law? "My pills," Harold gasped, patting his jacket pocket with shaking fingers. "Margaret, I need—" The doorknob began turning again, this time with deliberate purpose. Margaret's mind raced through scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. What if they were trapped in some kind of psychological experiment? What if the house contained dangerous gases that caused hallucinations? What if they'd stumbled into the domain of someone deeply disturbed, someone who'd been living in delusion for decades? She thought of all the true crime documentaries Harold watched, stories of isolated madmen who create elaborate fantasies to escape reality's harsh edges. What if Captain James Thornfield had never left at all? What if he'd spent 80 years maintaining this shrine to a war that had moved on without him, preserving newspapers and brewing fresh coffee, and living in a 1943 that existed only in his fractured mind? The footsteps resumed their approach, but now Margaret heard something new in their rhythm: hesitation. Whoever was coming seemed as uncertain as they were, as if this encounter was as unexpected for him as it was for them. "The real estate agent," Harold wheezed, fumbling with his pill bottle. "Miss Chen. She knew, didn't she? $10 for a mansion, she was getting rid of us, feeding us to whatever lives here." Margaret's teacher instincts, honed by 40 years of protecting children from schoolyard bullies and playground predators, suddenly blazed to life. She'd been a fool to think this was an adventure. This was danger, pure and simple, and she'd led her fragile husband directly into its path. "The car," she said urgently, abandoning her whisper for desperate efficiency. "Harold, We need to get to the car." But when she turned toward the window, her heart sank. Their Honda Civic sat in the circular driveway, but the morning fog had thickened while they'd been inside, rolling across the grounds like a living thing. The car seemed miles away instead of yards, separated from them by an ocean of gray mist that could hide anything. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door again. This time, Margaret heard breathing, slow, controlled, human. The sound should have been reassuring, but instead it filled her with primordial dread. Whatever waited out there was real, corporeal, alive in ways that made their situation infinitely more dangerous than ghosts or hallucinations. Harold's pill bottle clattered to the floor, white tablets scattering across the Persian rug like scattered teeth. He pressed both hands to his chest, his face contorting with pain that was entirely too familiar. "No," Margaret whispered, dropping to her knees beside him. "Harold, no, not here, not now." She'd promised to protect him, had sworn after his heart attack that she'd never again let him face stress alone. Instead, she'd dragged him into a nightmare that defied every rational explanation. Her curiosity, her desperate hunger for meaning in their twilight years, had become a weapon pointed at his weakening heart. The door handle stopped moving. The breathing on the other side grew deeper, as if their unseen visitor was gathering courage for what came next. Margaret cradled Harold's face in her hands, feeling the stubble he'd missed while shaving in their hasty departure from Boston. His eyes, the same warm brown that had steadied her through their daughter's teenage years and her father's long decline, now reflected nothing but fear and the bitter knowledge that she'd failed him when he needed her most. "I'm sorry," she whispered against his forehead. "I'm so sorry, my love." Outside the study door, someone cleared their throat politely, as if announcing their presence at a social gathering rather than a scene of mounting terror. The sound was heartbreakingly human, achingly normal, and somehow more frightening than any ghostly moan or supernatural shriek could have been. Margaret's world narrowed to the desperate mathematics of survival. Harold's pills scattered across the Persian rug like small white stones marking a path to disaster. His breathing came in ragged gasps, each one a countdown she couldn't bear to witness. "Excuse me?" came a voice from beyond the door, cultured, apologetic, tinged with what sounded like genuine concern. I couldn't help but notice, "Is someone in distress?" The voice belonged unmistakably to a younger man, probably in his 30s, with the crisp diction of someone educated before television flattened American accents into uniformity. Margaret found herself caught between terror and an absurd impulse to answer politely, as if good manners could somehow normalize their impossible situation. Harold clutched her wrist, his wedding ring cutting into her skin. "Don't," he wheezed. "Margaret, don't answer." But the voice continued, patient and oddly formal. "I have medical training, if that would be helpful. Flight surgeons learn field medicine. Occupational necessity, I'm afraid." Flight surgeon. The words hit Margaret like ice water. She stared at the door, remembering the military uniform hanging in the bedroom closet, pressed and ready for duty. The flight logs documenting impossible missions. The coffee still warm after 8 decades. Captain James Thornfield was offering to help her husband. "This isn't real," she whispered, more to herself than to Harold. "This can't be real." "Reality," came the measured response from beyond the door, "has proven remarkably flexible in my experience, particularly since the war began making demands that textbooks never covered." Harold's face had gone ashen, his lips taking on a blue tinge that made Margaret's chest constrict with familiar panic. She'd watched him nearly die once already in their sterile Boston kitchen, surrounded by the comfortable debris of their ordinary life. Now she knelt beside him in a room that shouldn't exist, listening to a dead man offer salvation through a door she was terrified to open. The choice crystallized with brutal clarity: cling to sanity while Harold collapsed, or embrace impossibility and save him. "My husband," she called out, her voice cracking. "His heart. He's having an episode. May I enter? I give you my word as an officer and a gentleman that I mean no harm." Margaret looked down at Harold, seeing her own reflection in his frightened eyes. 52 years of marriage had taught her to read his expressions like familiar scripture. She saw his fear, yes, but beneath it something else, a flicker of hope, perhaps, or simply exhaustion with running from the inexplicable. He nodded, almost imperceptibly. "Yes," Margaret said, the word feeling like stepping off a cliff. "Please." The door opened with a whisper of well-oiled hinges. Captain James Thornfield stood on the threshold exactly as she'd imagined him. Tall, lean, wearing a perfectly pressed Army Air Forces uniform that belonged in a museum. His dark hair was combed with military precision. His face angular and serious, marked by the kind of gravity that war carved into young men's features. He might have been 35, though his eyes seemed older. He was also unmistakably, absolutely real. "Ma'am," he said, stepping into the room with brisk efficiency. He knelt beside Harold with practiced ease, his fingers finding Harold's wrist to check his pulse. Tachycardia, but steady. "When did this begin?" Margaret found herself answering automatically, her teacher's training overriding shock. "A few minutes ago. He has medication, nitroglycerine, but the bottle fell." Thornfield spotted the scattered pills immediately, gathering several with careful precision. Under the tongue, he instructed Harold gently, placing a tablet where it would dissolve quickest. "And try to slow your breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth." Harold followed the instructions with the desperate compliance of a drowning man accepting a life preserver. Color began returning to his cheeks as the medication took effect. "Better," Thornfield observed after a moment, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to crisis. "Though I'd recommend rest and observation." He looked up at Margaret, and she saw nothing supernatural in his gaze, only the concerned professionalism of a man trained to preserve life. "Perhaps some tea? I've found it helps with shock." Margaret stared at him, this impossible man who spoke of tea and medical training as if he hadn't been missing for 80 years. "You're him," she whispered. "You're Captain Thornfield." "Indeed." He stood, offering Harold a steadying hand. "Though I suspect you have questions about that particular designation." Questions seemed inadequate for their situation, like asking for directions while falling through empty sky. Margaret felt the last threads of her rational worldview snapping one by one. They couldn't leave now. Harold needed immediate care, and their mysterious host had just demonstrated both medical competence and inexplicable reality. She was committed now, whether by choice or circumstance. The threshold had been crossed. "Tea," she heard herself saying. "Yes, that sounds sensible." Captain Thornfield helped Harold to his feet with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to managing wounded men. Margaret watched, transfixed, as her husband leaned heavily on the arm of a man who should have been dust and bones for decades. "The kitchen will be more comfortable," Thornfield said, his voice carrying that same measured calm. "Better lighting, proper seating, essential for recovery." As they moved through the hallway, Margaret noticed details that had escaped her earlier exploration. Fresh flowers, actual fresh flowers, stood in a crystal vase on a side table. The smell of bacon lingered in the air, mixed with cigarette smoke and something she couldn't identify, something medicinal and sharp. It was as if the house breathed with its own rhythm, maintaining itself through some incomprehensible force of will. The kitchen proved to be a monument to 1940s domesticity, complete with a white enamel stove that hummed with gentle heat and cheerful yellow wallpaper depicting tiny roosters and wheat sheaves. A plate sat beside the sink, remnants of eggs and toast still visible, a fork positioned as if its user had simply stepped away for a moment. "Please, sit." Thornfield indicated 2 chairs at a small breakfast table. "Mrs. Whitmore," Margaret supplied automatically. "Margaret Whitmore. This is my husband Harold." "A pleasure." Despite the circumstances. Thornfield moved with economical grace, filling a kettle and setting it on the stove with motions that spoke of long familiarity. "I must apologize for the surprise. Visitors are unusual." Harold found his voice, though it came out strained. "How long have you been here?" Thornfield paused in reaching for a tea canister, his back still turned to them. When he spoke, Margaret heard something new in his tone, Not uncertainty exactly, but a careful choosing of words. Time, he said slowly, has become somewhat negotiable in this house. I've been here since October 1943 by my calendar, though I understand the external world has moved considerably beyond that date. It's 2023, Margaret said gently, as if breaking news of a death. The war ended in 1945. Yes. Thornfield turned back to them, his expression unreadable. I've gathered as much from various indicators, your clothing, your speech, patterns, the vehicle in my driveway. He paused. We won, I assume? You won, Harold confirmed, his voice strengthening as the medication continued its work. Germany surrendered in May 45, Japan in August. Something flickered across Thornfield's features, relief, perhaps, or vindication. But it passed quickly, replaced by that same careful composure. Good, he said simply. That makes the sacrifices worthwhile. The kettle began to whistle, a sound so normal it seemed obscene in their surreal situation. Thornfield prepared tea with the same methodical precision he'd shown treating Harold, measuring leaves into a proper china pot, as if hosting afternoon visitors rather than interdimensional refugees. Captain, Margaret began, then stopped. How did one politely inquire about the mechanics of temporal displacement? This house, what happened here? A reasonable question. He poured steaming water over the tea leaves, the domestic ritual strangely comforting. Though I'm not certain I can provide a satisfactory answer. I was meant to report for a mission, a bombing run over Berlin, on October 15, 1943. I never made it to the airfield. Why not? Thornfield's hands stilled on the teapot. I received word that morning. My unit had been shot down 3 days prior. All hands lost, including myself, apparently. He looked up at them, his eyes holding depths Margaret couldn't fathom. It seems the Army Air Forces has very definite ideas about my continued existence. Harold leaned forward, his carpenter's mind grappling with impossible logistics. But you're here. You're alive. Am I? Thornfield's smile held no warmth. I eat, sleep, breathe, maintain my equipment, file my reports. I follow my orders and complete my missions. By every measurable standard, yes, I'm alive. He paused. But I haven't aged a day since that October morning. The newspapers still arrive with yesterday's date, yesterday being October 14th, 1943. And when I complete a mission, I return here to find everything exactly as I left it, ready to begin again. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Begin again? The same mission, the same briefing, the same target coordinates. Thornfield poured tea into delicate china cups, his movements precise, despite the tremor Margaret now noticed in his hands. I've flown to Berlin 847 times, Mrs. Whitmore. I've bombed the same factory, rescued the same downed airmen, delivered the same intelligence reports, and each time I returned to find my breakfast still warm, my orders still sealed, my duty still calling. Harold accepted his cup with shaking fingers. That's impossible. Indeed. Thornfield settled into his chair with military posture, though Margaret caught something haunted in his expression. Yet here we sit, discussing impossibilities over perfectly ordinary tea. The fog outside pressed against the windows like searching fingers, and Margaret realized that nothing about their situation was ordinary at all. The silence stretched between them like a held breath, punctuated only by the gentle tick of a clock somewhere in the kitchen's depths and the soft clink of china as Harold set down his cup with trembling fingers. Margaret watched steam rise from her tea, trying to process the impossible mathematics of Captain Thornfield's existence while her husband's face slowly regained its natural color. 847 times, she repeated, the number feeling foreign on her tongue. The same mission, over and over. Indeed. Thornfield's fingers traced the rim of his cup, a gesture that seemed unconscious, practiced. Though I've begun to wonder if the missions themselves are changing, even if I remember them identically. Small details that don't align with previous flights, different cloud formations, radio chatter that varies by a word or two. Either my memory is becoming unreliable or something about this condition is evolving. Harold cleared his throat, his voice stronger now but still cautious. When you fly these missions, where do you go exactly? I mean, if it's 1943 here, but 2023 out there. An excellent question, Mr. Whitmore. One I've pondered considerably. Thornfield rose and moved to the kitchen window, peering out at the fog that seemed to pulse with its own internal light. When I leave this house, when I walk to what should be Westover Airfield, I find it exactly as it was in 1943. My squadron, my commanding officers, the ground crew, all present and accounted for. We conduct our briefing, run our checks, take to the air. He paused, his reflection ghostly in the window glass. But when I return, successful mission logged, I drive back through that fog and find my house waiting, newspaper folded precisely as I left it, breakfast growing cold on the very plate you see there. Margaret followed his gesture to the abandoned meal by the sink, noting how the egg yolk had congealed but not dried, the toast firm but not stale. Preserved in temporal amber, she thought, like everything else in this impossible place. The people you fly with, Harold pressed, leaning forward despite Margaret's worried glance. Do they remember the previous missions? Do they age? Thornfield turned back to them, and Margaret caught something raw in his expression. A vulnerability he'd kept carefully hidden beneath military bearing. They remember nothing beyond their current day. For them, each mission is new, each briefing fresh intelligence. They greet me as they always have, discuss weather and equipment as if we'd never spoken before. His voice dropped. I've watched the same navigator die 17 times, Mr. Whitmore, shot down over occupied France, his parachute in flames, and each time I see him the next morning, he claps my shoulder and asks if I'm ready to give Jerry hell. The weight of that revelation settled over the kitchen like a physical presence. Margaret felt her teacher's heart breaking for this man trapped in an endless cycle of loss and duty, watching friends die again and again while he remained locked in his own temporal prison. That's torture, she whispered. That's war, Thornfield corrected, though his smile held no conviction. Or perhaps what war becomes when you can't leave it behind, when duty transcends death itself. Harold was studying the captain with the same intensity he'd once brought to examining problematic joints in antique furniture. You said you received word that your unit was shot down, including yourself. What if... He hesitated, glancing at Margaret as if seeking permission for dangerous speculation. What if you did die that day? What if this isn't about being trapped in time, but about being trapped between life and death? The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from Thornfield's cigarettes. Margaret felt something cold crawl up her spine as she considered the implications, that they weren't speaking with a temporally displaced pilot, but with a ghost who refused to acknowledge his own demise. An intriguing theory, Thornfield said mildly, though Margaret noticed how his hands had stilled completely, though it raises certain practical questions. Ghosts, in my understanding, don't typically require breakfast or file mission reports. Maybe, Harold continued, his carpenter's logic building momentum, your ghost doesn't know it's dead. Maybe you've constructed this entire reality, the missions, the house, the endless repetition, because you can't accept what happened. The temperature in the kitchen seemed to drop several degrees. Outside, the fog pressed closer to the windows, and Margaret could have sworn she heard something in the distance. Engines, perhaps, the drone of aircraft that shouldn't exist. Thornfield set down his teacup with deliberate precision, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the suddenly tense air. When he looked up at them, his eyes held depths that Margaret realized she'd been afraid to examine too closely. Mr. Whitmore, he said quietly, I believe you may be preparing to suggest something that could change everything. Are you quite certain you wish to proceed? Harold met Thornfield's gaze with the stubborn determination that Margaret had watched him bring to 40 years of impossible carpentry jobs, rotted foundations that shouldn't hold, joints that defied physics, structures that demanded resurrection from apparent ruin. I think, Harold said slowly, each word measured like a craftsman selecting the right tool, that you need to remember what really happened on October 15, 1943. Not the version where you received word of your unit's fate, but what actually occurred when you tried to report for duty. The silence that followed pressed against Margaret's eardrums like diving too deep underwater. Outside, the fog had thickened to an unnatural density, swirling in patterns that hurt to follow directly. She could hear those engines more clearly now, distant but growing closer, the rhythmic drone of wartime aircraft that belonged to museums and history books. Thornfield's face had gone perfectly still, a mask of military composure that couldn't quite hide the tremor in his hands. "I remember quite clearly, Mr. Whitmore. The telephone call came at 0630 hours. My commanding officer informed me that—" "No." Harold's interruption cut through the kitchen like a blade. "That's not what happened. That's what you tell yourself happened, because the truth is too much to bear." He struggled to his feet, Margaret's steadying hand on his arm, and moved toward the captain with the careful steps of a man approaching a wounded animal. "You died that morning, didn't you? Before you ever reached the airfield, before you could complete whatever mission was waiting." The engines were louder now, unmistakably approaching. Margaret felt the windows rattle in their frames, saw the delicate china cups dance against their saucers. But Thornfield seemed not to notice, his attention fixed on Harold with an intensity that made the air itself feel dangerous. "That's impossible," Thornfield said, though his voice carried the hollow quality of someone reciting lines they no longer believed. "I've filed 847 mission reports. I've bombed Berlin, rescued downed airmen, delivered intelligence that helped win the war you claim ended in 1945. You've been trying to complete your duty for 80 years, Harold pressed, moving closer despite Margaret's whispered protests. "Trapped in this house, in this moment, because you can't accept that you failed to make it to that final mission. The guilt won't let you rest." The captain's facade cracked like ice under sudden pressure. Margaret saw something raw and desperate flash across his features, a glimpse of the young man who'd once been terrified and eager and utterly human before war and death and endless repetition had worn him down to this hollow echo of purpose. "I had orders," Thornfield whispered, and for the first time his voice sounded truly young. "They were counting on me. The mission was crucial, intelligence about German radar installations that could save hundreds of lives. I wouldn't abandon my responsibility." The engines overhead reached a crescendo that rattled Margaret's teeth. Through the fog-shrouded windows, she caught glimpses of dark shapes moving through the sky, bombers in formation, their shadows passing over the house like ghosts of America's aerial armada. "How did you die?" Harold asked gently, and Margaret realized her husband had become something more than a retired carpenter in this moment. He was a confessor, a guide leading a lost soul toward truth it had been fleeing for 8 decades. Thornfield's composure finally shattered completely. He sank into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him, his hands covering his face with a gesture that spoke of infinite exhaustion. "Car accident," he said through his fingers, each word torn from some deep wound. "Driving to the airfield in the fog. Just like today, fog so thick I couldn't see 5 feet ahead. I was late, rushing, pushing too hard because the briefing was scheduled for 0700 and I couldn't be late. Couldn't let my unit down." His voice broke. "I never saw the tree." Margaret felt her heart shatter for this man who'd been carrying impossible guilt for longer than she'd been alive. The bombers overhead began to fade, their mission complete, leaving only the whisper of fog against glass and the sound of a dead pilot finally confronting the truth of his own mortality. "The crash threw me from the vehicle," Thornfield continued, his voice now barely audible. "I remember lying in the ditch, feeling the cold seep through my uniform, knowing I was dying and knowing I'd failed. My squadron would fly without crucial intelligence. Men would die because I couldn't fulfill my duty." Harold knelt beside the captain's chair with painful effort, his own mortality making the gesture more profound. "And so you built this place," he said softly. "This endless loop where you could keep trying, keep serving, keep attempting to fulfill the mission you never completed." The fog began to thin outside, revealing glimpses of the modern world beyond, power lines, distant traffic, the 21st century that had moved on without Captain James Thornfield. For the first time in 80 years, the dead pilot began to weep. The sound of Thornfield's weeping filled the kitchen like the breaking of something precious and irreplaceable. Margaret watched tears track down his weathered face, the first human tears this house had witnessed in 8 decades, and felt her own eyes burn in response. But even as her heart broke for this lost soul, she sensed something shifting in the very foundations of their reality. The house began to shake. Not the gentle tremor of passing aircraft, but a deep structural shuddering that made the china dance frantically in the cupboards and sent Harold scrambling for support against the kitchen counter. Margaret gripped the table as the floorboards beneath her feet groaned in protest, as if the confession of truth was physically tearing apart the careful construct of Thornfield's eternal October morning. "What's happening?" Harold shouted over the increasing rumble, his face pale with more than just his heart condition. Thornfield looked up through his tears, and Margaret saw something she hadn't expected, relief warring with terror in his eyes. "The truth," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "After all these years, the truth is finally setting me free." But freedom, Margaret realized with growing horror, might destroy them all. The walls began to flicker like a badly tuned television, showing glimpses of decay beneath the perfect 1940s preservation. She caught flashes of peeling wallpaper, rotted wood, broken windows, the reality of what this house should have become after 8 decades of abandonment. The cheerful yellow roosters on the wallpaper seemed to writhe and dance as the temporal bubble that had sustained them started to collapse. "We need to get out," Margaret said, reaching for Harold as another violent tremor nearly knocked him from his feet. "The house is coming apart." "No," Thornfield stood with effort, wiping his eyes but moving toward them with sudden urgency. "You don't understand. If this construct fails while you're inside it, you'll be trapped in the collapse. The temporal displacement will—" His words cut off as the kitchen window exploded inward, not from impact, but from simple structural failure as 80 years of accumulated time tried to assert itself all at once. Cold October air rushed in, but it wasn't the crisp autumn morning they'd entered. This was the bitter cold of deep winter, of years that had passed without heating, of a house that had been dead longer than most people lived. Margaret felt panic claw at her chest as she realized their situation. They'd come here to explore, to satisfy curiosity about a strange estate sale. Now they were trapped in the death throes of a temporal anomaly with a man who was already 80 years gone. Harold made it 3 steps toward the door before his knees buckled. The stress, the impossible revelations, the sheer wrongness of their situation, it was too much for his damaged heart. Margaret watched in horror as her husband of 47 years collapsed to the floor, his face gray and his breathing shallow. "Harold!" She dropped beside him, her hands finding his pulse, rapid and irregular, the rhythm of a heart trying to beat its way out of a chest that could no longer support it. The medication Thornfield had given him was wearing off, and the mounting terror was pushing his system beyond its limits. "I can help him," Thornfield said, moving toward his medical supplies, but even as he spoke, Margaret could see him beginning to fade. The edges of his uniform were becoming translucent, his carefully maintained appearance dissolving as the truth of his death finally claimed him. "Don't you dare leave us!" Margaret screamed, cradling Harold's head as her husband's eyes rolled back. "You brought us into this. You have to help us get out." But Thornfield was disappearing by degrees, his voice already distant as if speaking from across a great divide. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I never meant. I only wanted to complete my mission." The house gave another tremendous shudder, and Margaret felt the floor tilt at an impossible angle. Dishes crashed from cupboards as gravity itself seemed to lose its grip on the deteriorating space. Through the broken window, she could see the fog beginning to lift, revealing not the Connecticut countryside they'd driven through that morning, but something else entirely. A gray wasteland where time had forgotten to move forward. Harold's pulse was growing weaker under her fingers. The man who had spent his life building and repairing was breaking down in her arms, and she was powerless to fix him. Around them, the house continued its accelerating collapse into temporal chaos, walls phasing in and out of existence as past and present fought for dominance. Margaret pressed her face against Harold's chest, listening to the irregular flutter of his heart, and realized with crystalline clarity that she was about to lose everything. Her husband, her life, their quiet retirement dreams, all of it was dissolving like Thornfield's ghost in the ruins of his self-imposed purgatory. The last thing she heard before the house collapsed entirely around them was the distant sound of aircraft engines, flying home from a war that ended before she was born. The world went silent. Not the gentle quiet of snowfall or the peaceful hush of deep sleep, but the absolute absence of sound that came with death itself. Margaret's ears rang in the vacuum, her lungs struggling against air that felt thick as cotton. Harold lay motionless in her arms, his chest rising and falling in barely perceptible movements that seemed to grow weaker with each passing second. Around them, the collapsed remains of Thornfield's house hung suspended in impossible space, fragments of kitchen chairs floating like debris from a sunken ship, pieces of wallpaper drifting through air that shouldn't exist. The fog had lifted completely, revealing what lay beneath the temporal bubble that had sustained the captain's delusion for 8 decades. They were in the place between places, the void where broken time went to die. Margaret felt her rational mind, the careful, organized consciousness that had guided 40 years of teaching, fracture like ice under impossible pressure. This wasn't happening, couldn't be happening. People didn't fall through cracks in reality while exploring estate sales. Ghosts didn't maintain perfect breakfast settings for 80 years. Time didn't collapse in on itself like a house of cards built from trauma and guilt. Yet here she was, holding her dying husband in a space that existed outside the normal flow of existence, watching the last remnants of a dead pilot's constructed reality dissolve into gray nothingness. Margaret. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, carrying the weight of infinite sadness. Thornfield materialized in front of them, but not as the solid, uniformed figure they'd been speaking with. This was the essence of him. Translucent, wavering, a soul finally accepting its long-delayed departure. "I can't hold this space much longer," he said, his form flickering like candlelight in wind. The revelation broke the construct. Without the delusion to anchor it, the temporal displacement is collapsing. Margaret wanted to scream at him, to demand solutions and rescue and the impossible return to their normal October morning. Instead, she found herself studying his fading features and seeing past the military bearing to the young man beneath, barely 25 when he died, an entire life stolen by fog and duty and the cruel mathematics of wartime logistics. "You were just a boy," she whispered, the realization hitting her like physical force. "Dear God, you were just a frightened boy trying to do his job." Thornfield's expression cracked, revealing depths of pain that 8 decades hadn't diminished. "I was responsible for 17 lives, Margaret. 17 pilots who flew without the intelligence I was supposed to deliver. I've spent 80 years trying to complete that mission, to justify my existence, to prove that my death meant something." Harold stirred in her arms, his eyes fluttering open with tremendous effort. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Not your fault." The dying man's words carried more power than Margaret had expected. Thornfield's form solidified slightly, as if Harold's forgiveness was a lifeline thrown across the void of self-imposed guilt. "The war would have continued with or without your intelligence," Harold continued, each word a monumental effort. "Young men would have died regardless. That's the nature of war, not the fault of one pilot who hit black ice in the fog." Margaret felt something shift in the space around them, a loosening, as if chains that had bound this place for 8 decades were finally beginning to rust through. But with that freedom came terrifying instability. The floating debris of the kitchen was beginning to spin faster, pulled by forces she couldn't comprehend toward what looked like a tear in reality itself. "I understand now," Thornfield said, his voice growing fainter as his form became more translucent. "I wasn't protecting my squadron by staying, I was protecting myself from the truth of my own powerlessness, from accepting that some things can't be fixed, can't be completed, can't be made right through sheer force of will." The revelation should have brought peace. Instead, Margaret felt the void around them begin to pull with increasing force, as if the collapse of Thornfield's delusion was creating a vacuum that threatened to drag everything into non-existence. Harold's breathing became more labored, his heart struggling against the stress of existing in a place that shouldn't be possible. "We're going to die here," Margaret said, and the words carried no emotion. She was beyond fear now, beyond panic, existing in the strange clarity that came with absolute certainty. They had stumbled into something larger than themselves, a wound in time itself, and there was no way out. That didn't require a sacrifice none of them could make. "No," Thornfield said, his voice growing stronger even as his form grew fainter. "I understand my mission now. Not the one I failed 80 years ago, but the one I was meant to complete today." Margaret looked into his fading eyes and saw something that made her breath catch, not the desperate guilt of a failed soldier, but the determined peace of a man who had finally found his true purpose. "I'm going to get you home," he said, and began to fade away entirely. "This time, I won't fail." The void shuddered around them, as Thornfield's final words echoed through the collapsing space. Margaret felt the ghost's newfound resolve like a physical force, pushing back against the hungry darkness that sought to drag them into non-existence. His translucent form began to glow with pale light, not the artificial warmth of his preserved kitchen, but something deeper, purer. "Hold on to Harold," Thornfield commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a pilot taking control of a failing aircraft. "Whatever happens, don't let go." Margaret tightened her grip on her husband's unconscious form, feeling his heart flutter weakly against her palm. Around them, the floating debris of the kitchen began to spiral inward, drawn by the same force that was pulling at their clothes, their hair, their very breath. But Thornfield stood firm against the current, his hands spread wide as if he could physically hold back the collapse through sheer determination. "I spent 80 years learning to manipulate time," he said, strain evident in his voice as sweat beaded on his fading brow. "Bending it, shaping it, forcing it to serve my guilt. Now I'm going to use that knowledge to save instead of hide." The tear in reality widened, revealing glimpses of what lay beyond. Not the gentle Connecticut countryside they'd driven through that morning, but the actual basement of the ruined mansion where their car still sat parked. Margaret could see sunlight streaming through broken windows, could smell the musty dampness of genuine decay instead of Thornfield's perpetual autumn morning. "You're creating a bridge," Harold whispered, his eyes opening with sudden clarity despite his failing heart, "using your connection to anchor a path back to our time." Thornfield nodded, his uniform now completely translucent, but his expression more solid than it had been since they'd met him. "Every ghost story needs an ending, Mr. Whitmore. I've just been too afraid to write mine." Margaret felt the pull intensify, but now it was drawing them toward the tear rather than into the void. She could sense Thornfield's energy flowing into the passage he was creating, each second of its existence costing him something irreplaceable. The young pilot, who had spent 8 decades refusing to die, was finally choosing to let go. "Will we remember?" Margaret asked, surprising herself with the question. Part of her wanted to forget this impossible morning, to return to a world where time moved in straight lines and the dead stayed buried. But another part, the teacher who had spent her life seeking truth, needed to carry this knowledge forward. "Everything," Thornfield promised. "Someone should remember James Thornfield, not the guilty ghost, but the young man who tried to serve his country and died in the fog. Someone should know that he finally completed his real mission." The bridge solidified into a tunnel of swirling light, its far end showing the familiar basement where their exploration had begun. Margaret could see their footprints in the dust, evidence of their journey into impossibility, but the tunnel was narrowing with each passing second, Thornfield's strength ebbing as he poured his essence into maintaining the passage. "Go," he urged, his form now barely visible except for his eyes, young, tired, finally at peace. Before the way closes, Margaret struggled to lift Harold, her 70-year-old arms protesting the weight of her husband's unconscious form. Thornfield moved to help, his ghostly hands somehow finding enough substance to support Harold's shoulders as they carried him toward the tunnel of light. "Thank you," Margaret said as they reached the threshold. "For everything. for the coffee, for the conversation, for not letting us die in your guilt." Thornfield smiled, the first genuine expression of joy she'd seen from him. "Thank you for giving me the courage to remember who I was before the war made me a ghost." The tunnel entrance crackled with unstable energy, reality bending under the strain of Thornfield's sacrifice. Margaret felt the familiar weight of linear time waiting on the other side, the comfortable prison of cause and effect that made normal life possible. She looked back once at the young pilot who had taught her that some hauntings were acts of love rather than vengeance. "Fly safe, Captain," she whispered. "Roger that, ma'am," he replied with military precision, then faded entirely as his final mission reached completion. Margaret stepped through the tunnel with her husband in her arms, feeling the world slam back into familiar patterns around them. They tumbled onto the dusty basement floor of the actual mansion, decrepit, abandoned, mercifully empty of impossible breakfast settings and temporal anomalies. Harold's eyes opened immediately, his color already improving as his heart found its normal rhythm in linear time. Above them, autumn sunlight streamed through broken windows, illuminating decades of genuine decay and the simple truth that some houses were just houses, even when they contained the echoes of extraordinary stories. Margaret helped Harold to his feet, both of them moving with the careful deliberation of people who had looked into the void and somehow found their way home. They had entered the mansion as curious retirees seeking adventure. They emerged as witnesses to a love story disguised as a ghost story, the tale of a young pilot who had finally learned to let go. Margaret sat on the dusty basement floor for several minutes, her arms still trembling from carrying Harold through Thornfield's dying light. The silence felt different now. Not the oppressive weight of temporal displacement, but the simple quiet of an abandoned house settling into another October afternoon. Dust motes danced in genuine sunlight, and somewhere above them she could hear the normal sounds of wind through broken shutters and leaves scratching against rotted siding. Harold's breathing had steadied, his color returning to the healthy pink she'd known for 47 years. But when their eyes met, she saw that he carried the same burden she did, the weight of impossible knowledge, the responsibility of being witness to something the world would never believe. "We can't just leave," Margaret said quietly, helping Harold to his feet. Her voice echoed strangely in the empty basement, so different from the warm acoustic embrace of Thornfield's preserved kitchen. "Not yet." Harold nodded, understanding without explanation. They had been chosen for this experience, drawn here by forces beyond coincidence. Thornfield's story was complete, but theirs was not. They had obligations now, to memory, to truth, to a young pilot who had trusted them with his final moments. They climbed the basement stairs together, Harold moving slowly but steadily. The main floor greeted them with the honest decay they should have found that morning. Peeling wallpaper hanging in strips, floorboards warped and stained by decades of weather, windows clouded with grime and spiderwebs. No cheerful yellow roosters, no warm scent of coffee, no impossible newspaper dated 1943. But in the study where Thornfield had shown them his flight logs, Margaret found what she was looking for. Hidden beneath a collapsed section of ceiling, protected by fallen timber that had somehow created a perfect shelter, lay a leather portfolio. Her hands shook as she opened it, revealing documents that were genuinely old, brittle paper, faded ink, the authentic weight of history rather than temporal manipulation. "His real records," Harold breathed, reading over her shoulder. "The actual James Thornfield." The documents told a different story than the impossible missions Thornfield had shown them. Here was a young man from Nebraska, graduated from pilot training with commendations for courage and skill, orders for reconnaissance missions over occupied France, letters from his squadron commander praising his dedication, and finally, the official report of his disappearance, aircraft presumed lost in heavy fog during a routine intelligence-gathering flight, pilot missing and presumed dead. No mention of failure, no record of critical intelligence left undelivered. Just the simple tragedy of a young man who flew into the fog one October morning in 1943 and never came home. "He wasn't responsible for anyone's death," Margaret whispered, tears blurring her vision as she read the squadron casualty reports. The 17 pilots he mentioned, They died in combat operations that had nothing to do with his mission. He carried guilt for 80 years over deaths that weren't his fault. Harold's hand found hers, squeezing gently. War does that to young men, makes them feel responsible for everything, even the things beyond their control. Margaret carefully gathered the documents, treating them with the reverence due to a young life cut short. These papers would go to the Ashford Historical Society, she decided. James Thornfield deserved to be remembered as he truly was, not as the guilt-ridden ghost who had haunted this mansion, but as the brave young pilot who had died serving his country. But first, they had one more obligation to fulfill. They found the spot in the back garden where the fog had been thickest that first morning, where Margaret now realized Thornfield's temporal bubble had been strongest. The ground was different here, not just overgrown, but somehow more alive, as if fed by decades of one man's desperate energy. Harold knelt with difficulty, his heart still adjusting to linear time, and began clearing away the weeds and debris. Beneath the overgrowth, they found stones that might once have been a small monument. Nothing official, just rocks arranged by someone who had cared enough to mark the spot where a young pilot's story had ended. Margaret placed Thornfield's photograph from the personnel file at the center of the cleared space. In the picture, he looked impossibly young, his smile untouched by the guilt that would define his afterlife. This was how he should be remembered, not as the fading ghost who had finally found peace, but as the hopeful boy who had volunteered to fly dangerous missions because he believed in something larger than himself. "We'll come back," Margaret promised, speaking to the wind and the settling house in the memory of a voice that had called her ma'am with military precision. "We'll make sure people remember the real James Thornfield." As they walked back to their car, Margaret felt the full weight of what lay ahead. They would have to find ways to tell this story that didn't sound like the ravings of two traumatized seniors. They would have to research and document and fight to have Thornfield's true service record acknowledged. They would have to become advocates for a dead pilot they'd known for less than a day, but who had changed them forever. The final confrontation wasn't with supernatural forces or temporal anomalies. It was with the ordinary world's refusal to believe in anything that challenged its comfortable assumptions about life and death. Margaret started the car, feeling the engine's familiar vibration anchor her firmly in the present. They had work to do. The drive back to town felt surreal in its ordinariness. Margaret's hands gripped the steering wheel while her mind struggled to reconcile the impossible morning they'd experienced with the mundane reality of stop signs and afternoon traffic. Beside her, Harold sat in contemplative silence, Thornfield's personnel file clutched against his chest like a sacred relic. "Where do we even begin?" Harold asked as they pulled into their own driveway, a simple ranch house that had never seemed more precious than in this moment of return. Margaret turned off the engine but didn't move to get out. The weight of their obligation pressed down on her like a physical force. "We start with what we can prove," she said, her teacher's instincts taking over. "The historical society, the military records, the property deed. We build a foundation of truth that can support the impossible parts." But even as she spoke, Margaret felt the magnitude of the challenge ahead. How could they make anyone believe that they'd had breakfast with a ghost, that they'd witnessed a man choose to die after 80 years of refusing to accept death? That love and guilt could bend time itself until a broken young pilot found the courage to let go. Harold seemed to read her thoughts. "It's not about making them believe everything," he said gently. "It's about making them remember James Thornfield. The rest is just how we got to know him." That evening, Margaret spread Thornfield's documents across their dining room table like pieces of a puzzle she was determined to solve. The brittle papers released the scent of old ink and decades of storage, each document a window into a life that had ended too soon. Birth certificate from Omaha, high school graduation photo, enlistment papers signed with a young man's confident flourish. "Look at this," Harold said, pointing to a letter tucked beneath the official reports. The handwriting was different, feminine, careful script on cream-colored paper, from his fiancée. Margaret lifted the letter with trembling fingers, reading words written in 1943 by a woman named Eleanor who had promised to wait, who had believed her pilot would come home from the war. The letter spoke of wedding plans and a small house they'd looked at together, of children they might have, and the quiet life they'd build when the fighting was over. She waited for him, Margaret whispered, scanning the careful sentences. God help her. She probably waited years before accepting he was never coming home. The weight of Thornfield's tragedy expanded in her mind. Not just a young man lost to war, but a woman left to grieve, a future erased, children never born. His temporal prison had stolen more than just his own afterlife. It had denied closure to everyone who had loved him. Margaret's resolve crystallized into something harder than determination. This wasn't just about honoring a ghost's memory anymore. It was about completing a story that had been left unfinished for 80 years, about bringing peace to Eleanor's memory as much as James's. She reached for her laptop, fingers moving across the keys with purpose. Ashford Historical Society, she typed, then World War II pilot records, then Eleanor Thornfield, Nebraska, 1943. If Eleanor had eventually married someone else, if she'd built a different life after the war, there might be children, grandchildren, people who deserved to know that James Thornfield had never forgotten his promise to come home. Harold watched her work, understanding without words that this had become something larger than either of them had anticipated. They weren't just witnesses anymore. They were detectives, archaeologists of the heart, determined to unearth every connection that Thornfield's disappearance had severed. The real test isn't whether people believe our story, Harold said quietly as Margaret's searches began yielding results. It's whether we can handle the responsibility of knowing it's true. Margaret paused in her typing, looking at her husband across the table, covered with a dead pilot's dreams. In the space of a single morning, they had been transformed from curious retirees into guardians of impossible truth. They held knowledge that could never be shared completely, memories that would sound like fantasy to anyone who hadn't lived them. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps some stories were meant to be carried rather than told, held sacred by those who had been chosen to witness them. Their burden wasn't to convince the world that ghosts existed. It was to ensure that one particular ghost would finally be remembered as the young man he'd been, rather than the guilt he'd become. Margaret returned to her research with renewed focus. The final test wasn't about supernatural confrontations or temporal anomalies. It was about having the courage to honor truth in a world that preferred comfortable lies, about fighting for the memory of a stranger who had trusted them with his most precious possession, the story of who he really was. Outside their window, October evenings settled over the Connecticut countryside, peaceful and ordinary. But in their dining room, surrounded by the documents of a life cut short, Margaret and Harold began the most important work of their 70 years, ensuring that love, finally, would prove stronger than death. The telephone rang at precisely 11:43 p.m., its shrill cry cutting through the October night like a blade. Margaret jolted awake from dreams filled with fog and temporal corridors, her heart hammering against her ribs as she reached for the receiver. Harold stirred beside her, his breathing labored from the day's impossible exertions. "Hello?" Margaret's voice cracked with exhaustion and lingering fear. Silence stretched across the line, broken only by a sound that made her blood freeze. The distant drone of aircraft engines, growing steadily louder. "Ma'am?" The voice was different now, strained and desperate where it had once been courteous. "Ma'am, I need your help." Margaret's hand tightened on the receiver. "James? But we saw you let go. You chose to die." "I tried." His words carried the weight of fresh desperation. "But she's here, ma'am. Eleanor's here, and she won't let me leave." The line crackled with interference that sounded increasingly like radio static from a 1940s cockpit. In the background, Margaret could hear a woman's voice calling out. Not the warm tones of a lover's greeting, but something sharper, more demanding. "She's been waiting," Thornfield continued, his voice fracturing with panic. "Waiting in the between space where the almost dead linger. She says I broke my promise. Says I can't have peace until I explain why I never came home." Harold sat up, his face pale in the moonlight streaming through their bedroom window. "Put it on speaker," he whispered, his carpenter's hands already reaching for his clothes. Margaret pressed the speaker button, and Eleanor's voice filled their bedroom like poison honey. "Bring them back, James. Bring your witnesses back to see what you really are. Let them watch you face the woman you abandoned." The temperature in their bedroom plummeted, their breath misting in air that suddenly tasted of aviation fuel and heartbreak. Margaret felt the familiar tug of temporal displacement. But this was different, angry, vindictive, powered by decades of abandoned love rather than guilt. "She's not Eleanor," Harold said with sudden clarity, his voice cutting through the supernatural interference. Eleanor would have wanted him to find peace. This is something else wearing her face. The thing that claimed to be Eleanor laughed, a sound like wind through bomber fuselages. "Clever old man. But it doesn't matter what I am, only what he believes I am. And James Thornfield believes he owes me an explanation for 80 years of broken promises." The walls of their bedroom began to shimmer, reality bending around the edges like heated glass. Margaret grabbed Harold's hand, feeling his wedding ring solid and warm against her palm, an anchor to linear time in a world increasingly unmoored from causality. "Don't come back," Thornfield pleaded across the impossible connection. "She's not just after me anymore. She's hungry for all the love stories that ended too soon, all the promises broken by war and death and time. If you return to the house—" The line went dead, but the silence was worse than the static. It carried the weight of a trap closing, of something ancient and bitter that had found their scent and would not rest until it had devoured their own 47 years of marriage. Margaret swung her legs out of bed, her 70-year-old joints protesting as she reached for her robe. "We have to go back." "Margaret, no." Harold's voice carried the authority of a man who had spent decades calculating structural loads and safety margins. "This is exactly what it wants. It's using Thornfield as bait to draw us into whatever temporal hell it's created. And if we don't go—" Margaret's teacher instincts were screaming warnings, but her heart overruled them. How many other love stories will it corrupt? How many other couples will it hunt through the cracks between life and death? The house around them groaned as if something vast had settled onto their roof. Through their bedroom window, Margaret could see their neighbor's porch light flickering with the rhythm of an old film reel, reality stuttering between frames as the entity's influence spread beyond the mansion's boundaries. Harold struggled to his feet, his face grim with the knowledge of what lay ahead. "This isn't about Thornfield anymore," he said, checking his heart medication with hands that barely trembled. "This is about us, about whether our love is strong enough to survive direct confrontation with something that feeds on broken promises." Margaret nodded, understanding that their morning's adventure had been merely preparation for this moment. The real test of everything they believed about love, death, and the power of two people to stand together against forces that sought to tear them apart. They dressed in the dark, moving with the careful efficiency of people preparing for war. Outside their window, the Connecticut countryside writhed under an October sky that flickered between present and past, and something that wore Eleanor's face waited hungrily for their return to a mansion where time itself had become a weapon. The final confrontation would not be fought with fists or faith, but with the simple, terrible courage required to love someone completely in the face of absolute darkness. The mansion materialized around them before Margaret could even turn off the car engine, reality collapsing the distance between their driveway and Thornfield's estate as if space itself had grown tired of pretense. One moment they sat in their familiar Honda beneath the flickering streetlight, the next they stood in the mansion's grand foyer, where shadows writhed like living things and the air tasted of tears and aviation fuel. "Welcome back." Eleanor's voice drifted from the parlor, sweet as poisoned honey. But when Margaret turned toward the sound, her breath caught in her throat. The thing wearing Eleanor's face had grown stronger, feeding on Thornfield's guilt until it could manifest with terrible clarity. She stood beside the fireplace where Margaret and Harold had shared coffee with a doomed pilot, but this Eleanor bore no resemblance to the young woman in the faded photograph. Her features shifted constantly, sometimes beautiful, sometimes terrible, always hungry. Thornfield knelt in the center of the room like a condemned man, his military bearing finally broken. The confident pilot who had served them breakfast was gone, replaced by something that flickered between the young airman who had died in 1943 and the guilt-ridden ghost who had haunted this place for 80 years. "Tell them," the false Eleanor commanded, her voice echoing with the authority of abandoned love. "Tell them how you chose duty over devotion. Tell them how easily you flew away from our future." Margaret stepped forward, her teacher's instincts recognizing manipulation, disguised as truth. "That's not what happened. We read his real service record. He died serving his country, not abandoning you." The entity's laugh was like wind through broken glass. "Death is just another abandonment, old woman. Another broken promise. James swore he'd come home to me, and instead he chose to fly into that fog." Harold moved to stand beside his wife, his carpenter's hands steady despite the supernatural cold that filled the room. He was 23 years old, doing what he thought was right. "And what about what I thought was right?" The false Eleanor's form solidified, becoming more terrible in its beauty. "I waited. I planned our wedding, bought fabric for my dress, chose names for children who would never be born. I gave him everything, and he gave me nothing but a grave with no body to bury." Margaret felt the entity's hunger like a physical pressure, its need to corrupt and devour love stories that had survived longer than Eleanor and James ever could. But in that hunger, she recognized something else, the desperate pain of a story left unfinished, of love that had nowhere to go except into bitterness. "You're not Eleanor," Margaret said softly, understanding flooding through her like dawn. "You're what's left when love has nowhere to go. You're all the abandoned promises, all the futures that died with him." The entity's form wavered, caught between rage and recognition. "I am what she became. What any woman becomes when the man she loves chooses death over keeping his word." Thornfield looked up from his position on the floor, his eyes meeting Margaret's with desperate hope. "She's right, though. I did choose. When the fog closed in, when I could have turned back, I chose to complete the mission instead of coming home to her." Margaret felt Harold's hand slip into hers. 47 years of marriage condensed into that single touch. In it, she found the strength to do what needed to be done, not to fight the entity, but to offer it something more powerful than bitter satisfaction. "Then choose again," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of decades spent helping young people find their way. "Choose now, both of you." The false Eleanor's form sharpened with interest. "What do you mean?" Margaret squeezed Harold's hand, feeling his understanding flow between them like shared blood. They had come here to save Thornfield, but victory would require a different kind of sacrifice. Not their lives, but the comfortable certainty of their remaining years together. "We'll stay," Margaret said, the words tearing from her throat like pieces of her soul. "We'll take your places in this temporal prison. Harold and I will carry the weight of unfinished love, and you can both find peace." Harold's grip tightened, but he didn't protest. After 70 years on Earth and 47 years of marriage, he understood that some victories could only be won by surrendering what you treasured most. "Margaret," Thornfield started to protest. "No," she said firmly, teacher's authority trumping ghostly desperation. "This is our choice. You and Eleanor get the ending that war stole from you. Go into whatever comes after, together. Harold and I will hold this place until our own time comes." The false Eleanor stared at them with something like wonder, her hungry expression shifting towards something that might have been gratitude. For the first time since they'd entered the mansion, she looked less like a predator and more like a young woman who had simply loved someone more than life itself. The entity's form began to soften, decades of bitterness melting away as it finally found what it had always sought, not revenge, but release. The transformation began slowly, like ice melting in spring sunlight. The false Eleanor's bitter edges softened first, her constantly shifting features settling into something recognizably human. The hunger that had radiated from her like heat dissipated, replaced by an expression Margaret had seen countless times in her classroom. The look of a student finally understanding a lesson that had eluded them for too long. "You would do that?" Eleanor asked, her voice no longer carrying the weight of 8 decades worth of abandonment. "You would give up your remaining years together for 2 strangers?" Margaret felt Harold's wedding ring pressing against her palm, 47 years of shared mornings and quiet evenings condensed into that simple circle of gold. The magnitude of what they were offering hit her like a physical blow. No more Sunday crosswords in bed, no more of Harold's terrible coffee, no more ordinary miracles of growing old together. But in Thornfield's eyes, she saw something that made the sacrifice bearable: hope. Real hope, for the first time since she'd met him. "We've had our time," Harold said quietly, his carpenter's pragmatism making peace with the impossible. 47 good years. You two never got your chance. The mansion around them began to change, the oppressive weight of temporal distortion lifting like fog before sunrise. The shadows in the corners stopped writhing, settling into ordinary darkness. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight with the steady rhythm of linear time restored. Eleanor moved toward Thornfield, her form solidifying with each step until she looked exactly like the young woman in the faded photograph, bright-eyed, full of dreams about the future they would build together. When she knelt beside him, her hand passing through his shoulder before finding substance, Margaret heard her breath catch with wonder. "James," Eleanor whispered, and in her voice was every letter she'd never been able to send, every prayer for his safe return that had gone unanswered. "I waited so long to touch you again." Thornfield looked up at her with the expression of a man seeing sunrise after 80 years of darkness. "I'm sorry. God, Eleanor, I'm so sorry I never made it home. You're here now," she said simply. "That's what matters." Margaret watched them embrace. These two young people whose love story had been interrupted by war and death, and the terrible weight of unfinished promises. There was something profoundly right about seeing them together, complete at last, even as her heart broke for what it meant. The air in the parlor began to shimmer, reality preparing to accommodate their passage to whatever came after this trapped existence between life and death. But before the light could claim them completely, Eleanor turned to Margaret and Harold with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said, the words carrying the weight of eternal gratitude. "Thank you for showing us that love doesn't have to become bitterness, that some stories can still have happy endings." Thornfield struggled to his feet, his military bearing returning as he faced the couple who had saved him. "I'll never forget what you've done. If there's any way to repay this debt—" "Just be happy," Margaret interrupted, her teacher's voice gentle but firm. "Be happy together. That's payment enough." The light surrounding them intensified, warm and golden like summer afternoon sunshine. Margaret felt the familiar tug of temporal displacement, but this time it carried no fear, only the bittersweet satisfaction of a job well done. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded. Margaret blinked, expecting to find herself in the mansion's parlor, preparing to begin her vigil as the house's new guardian. Instead, she stood in her own living room, Harold's hand still clasped in hers, surrounded by the comfortable clutter of their real life. "What?" Harold began, then stopped as understanding dawned. On their coffee table lay a single envelope, cream-colored paper, that smelled faintly of old roses. Margaret's name was written across it in Eleanor's careful script. With trembling fingers, she opened it and read, "Dear Margaret and Harold, your willingness to sacrifice everything for strangers showed us something we had forgotten. That love given freely has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. You offered us your remaining years, but we cannot take what is rightfully yours. Instead, we take your gift of understanding, that some love stories end in tragedy, but they don't have to end in bitterness. Live well. Love deeply. Remember us not as ghosts, but as two young people who finally found their way home. With eternal gratitude, Eleanor and James." Margaret sank into her armchair, the letter still clutched in her hands. Through their living room window, she could see the Connecticut countryside peaceful under an ordinary October sky. The mansion was gone, not destroyed but simply no longer needed. Without the weight of unfinished love to anchor it to the world, it had finally been allowed to fade into memory. Harold settled beside her, pulling her close with hands that smelled of sawdust and home. "So what do we do now?" Margaret leaned into his warmth, feeling the solid reality of their continued life together. "Now we live," she said simply. "We live, and we remember." Outside their window, dawn was breaking over Connecticut with an ordinary beauty that felt miraculous after everything they'd witnessed. Margaret watched the familiar maple tree in their yard catch the first rays of sunlight, its October leaves glowing amber and gold, colors that would have seemed impossible just hours ago, when reality itself had bent around the weight of unfinished love. Harold's arms tightened around her, and she could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her back, alive, present, theirs for however many years remained. The simple miracle of it brought tears to her eyes. "I keep thinking I should feel different," Harold murmured against her hair. "Like we should be changed somehow, after what we've seen." But Margaret was already discovering that they were changed, in ways both subtle and profound. When she looked at their living room, really looked at it, she saw it with new eyes. The coffee stains on Harold's favorite armchair weren't just signs of wear, they were evidence of 47 years of shared Sunday mornings. The stack of half-finished crossword puzzles wasn't clutter. They were proof of a love story that had been allowed to unfold day by ordinary day. "We are different," she said softly. "We just don't know it yet." The phone rang, startling them both. For a heart-stopping moment, Margaret feared it might be another call from beyond time itself. But the caller ID showed their daughter Sarah's number, and when Margaret answered, her voice carried only the normal concern of a woman checking on her aging parents. "Mom? I had the strangest dream about you and Dad last night. Are you both okay?" Margaret met Harold's eyes, seeing her own understanding reflected there. Their family had felt the temporal disturbance, sensed somehow that their parents had walked close to the edge of something vast and dangerous. The thought that their love story might have ended in that mansion, that Sarah might have woken to find herself orphaned by forces she could never understand, made Margaret's chest tight with retroactive terror. "We're fine, sweetheart," Margaret said, meaning it more completely than she ever had before. "We're home." After Sarah hung up, promising to visit next weekend, Margaret found herself moving through their house with the reverence of a tourist exploring a sacred site. In the kitchen, she touched the coffee pot, where Harold made his terrible morning brew, remembering how Captain Thornfield had served them breakfast in a room where time stood still. Their kitchen, with its ordinary appliances and familiar scratches on the countertops, felt like a temple to the miraculous persistence of linear time. Harold appeared in the doorway, watching her with the expression of a man seeing his wife clearly for the first time in years. "What are you thinking about?" "Eleanor's letter," Margaret said, running her fingers along the edge of their kitchen table. "She said some love stories end in tragedy but don't have to end in bitterness. I keep thinking about that." He crossed to her, his carpenter's hand settling on her shoulders with gentle certainty. "We've been lucky, haven't we? All these years, and we've never had to face what they did, never had to love someone across the divide between life and death." Margaret leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him. "But we would have, wouldn't we? If one of us died first, the other would keep loving. That's what marriage is, promising to love someone even when they can't love you back. Especially then," Harold agreed. They stood together in their kitchen as morning light filled the windows, both understanding that their encounter with Thornfield and Eleanor had been more than just a supernatural adventure. It had been a reminder of how precious and fragile their ordinary life together truly was. Over the following days, their friends and neighbors noticed small changes. Margaret began volunteering at the local historical society, helping families research loved ones who had died in distant wars. Harold started a woodworking project, a memorial bench for the town green, dedicated to couples separated by conflict. They moved through their daily routines with a new tenderness, as if they had been given the gift of seeing their life together from the outside. At night, Margaret would sometimes wake to find Harold watching her sleep, his expression soft with wonder. "What?" she'd whisper, and he'd smile. "Just thinking about how many mornings we've had," he'd say. "How many more we might get." The mansion's location remained empty, not even a foundation to mark where it had stood. But sometimes, driving past that stretch of country road, Margaret would catch a glimpse of movement in her peripheral vision. Never anything concrete, just the suggestion of two young people walking hand in hand through autumn woods, finally free to explore the future that war had stolen from them. They had returned to their ordinary world, but they carried with them the knowledge that love persists beyond death, beyond time, beyond the ability of tragedy to transform it into bitterness. That knowledge changed everything and nothing. Their daily routines remained the same, but now each shared glance held the weight of eternity. They had learned that some love stories end in tragedy, but the fortunate ones get to end in gratitude instead. Margaret's journal entry for October 15th simply read, "Ordinary day." Harold fixed the loose cabinet hinge. "I made vegetable soup." We watched the evening news together. She closed the notebook, but her pen lingered over the page. How do you record the miracle of mundane moments when you've seen love transcend death itself? 3 months had passed since the mansion, and their transformation had settled into something deeper than the immediate wonder of survival. It lived now in the small gestures. Harold's hand finding hers during television commercials, Margaret's habit of watching him work in his garage workshop, both of them savoring the simple luxury of growing older together. The memorial bench Harold had crafted now sat on the town green, its brass plaque reading, "In memory of all couples separated by war, and in celebration of love that endures." Sarah had asked about the inscription during her Christmas visit, puzzled by its specificity. Margaret had simply said it felt important to honor interrupted love stories, and Sarah had accepted this as another of her mother's teacherly impulses toward remembrance. Margaret's work at the Historical Society had become something more than volunteer service. She developed an intuition for the weight of unfinished stories, helping families trace loved ones whose fates had been lost to time and bureaucratic oversights. Last week, she'd helped a woman in her 60s find her grandfather's service record, a pilot who'd gone missing over the Pacific in 1944. When the woman wept with relief at finally knowing where he'd died, Margaret felt Eleanor and James in that moment of closure. "You've gotten good at this," Harold had said, watching her organize files in the Society's basement archive. "It's like you understand something about these lost stories that the rest of us miss." She'd looked up at him, this man who'd stood beside her in a room where time bent backward, who'd been willing to sacrifice their remaining years for strangers, and felt her heart expand with such fierce tenderness it nearly stopped her breath. Spring brought small revelations. Harold's heart condition, which had worsened during their supernatural encounter, began to stabilize. His doctor called it remarkable. Margaret called it a gift from two young people who'd finally found peace. They took longer walks now, exploring country roads they'd driven past for decades without really seeing. On one such walk, they passed the empty lot where the mansion had stood. The realtor's sign had finally come down, though no one could remember anyone purchasing the land. Wildflowers had begun to sprout where the foundation might have been, forget-me-nots and wild roses that bloomed out of season as if the earth itself remembered young love. "Do you think they're happy?" Harold asked, following her gaze toward the meadow. Margaret considered this, watching a pair of butterflies dance above the flowers. "I think they're complete. Maybe that's better than happy. They get to love each other without fear of loss now." Their own love had acquired a similar quality, though they remained thoroughly mortal. The constant, low-level anxiety that haunts long marriages, the awareness that one of you will inevitably leave, the other, had transformed into something more peaceful. They'd seen what love looked like when it refused to let go, and while beautiful, it had also shown them the grace in accepting endings. The changes weren't all profound. Harold still made terrible coffee. Margaret still corrected his pronunciation of words he'd been mispronouncing for 50 years. They still bickered about the thermostat and forgot each other's doctor's appointments. But underneath these familiar irritations ran a current of gratitude so deep it colored every interaction. On their 48th wedding anniversary, they drove to the coast where they'd honeymooned decades earlier. The hotel was gone, replaced by a condominium complex, but they found the beach where they'd walked as newlyweds. Harold's arthritis made the sand difficult to navigate, and Margaret's hip ached in the salt air, but they managed to reach the water's edge. "Any regrets?" Harold asked, the question they'd started asking each other after the mansion, not morbidly, but as a way of ensuring they were living fully in the time they had left. Margaret thought of Eleanor and James, frozen at 23 and 21, their love preserved but their story incomplete. She thought of all the ordinary years she and Harold had been granted, the arguments and reconciliations, the graduations and funerals, the quiet accumulation of shared experience that builds a life. None, she said, and meant it completely. The sun set over water that reflected their older faces, lined, gray-haired, marked by time in ways that young Eleanor and James would never be. But they'd earned these marks through the simple act of loving each other day after day, year after year, choosing each other again and again, in circumstances both extraordinary and mundane. They drove home through Connecticut countryside where spring was asserting itself in ordinary ways. Budding trees, returning birds, the reliable cycle of seasons unmarked by supernatural intervention. It was, Margaret thought, exactly as it should be. That night, Harold fell asleep first, his breathing steady and peaceful. Margaret lay beside him, listening to the sound of time passing in its proper direction, carrying them forward together into whatever mornings remained.